Alright, so for a very long time I underestimated how important camera settings actually are. And I think that is something a lot of people go through. I mean, you get a good camera, you just start shooting, you change things based on the situation, and you don't really have a system. But before we start, for those who don't know me, I'm a content creator and I make videos about photography and video making, mostly gear, tutorials and real-world tips based on what I actually use every day. Up until now, I've only been posting short-form content on Instagram. But from now, I want to start sharing longer and more in-depth videos here on YouTube and really explain the reason behind my settings and my workflow. Recently, I bought the Sony Alpha 7 C2 and my main goal wasn't the image quality, because honestly, most modern cameras actually look great. What I really wanted was for this camera to behave exactly like my Sony FX3. Same response, same exposure logic, same feeling when shooting. So before jumping into Sony menus and settings, I want to start from the basic, because this part applies to any camera you're using. The goal of this video is to show you the settings I personally use on most of my cameras and how I set them up to get consistent results every time. Since I recently got a new camera, I thought it would be a perfect chance to show you exactly which settings I use, step by step, and share some tips for anyone picking up a new camera and wanting to get the most out of it right away. The first thing I always lock in when shooting video is shutter speed. And this is probably one of the most common mistakes people make, especially at the beginning. So you are outside, it's super bright, and the first instinct is to raise your shutter speed just to make the exposure work. The main problem here is that as soon as you do that, the motion in your image completely changes. So movements start to feel sharp, almost a bit nervous, and you lose that natural motion blur that makes your video feel cinematic. If I'm shooting at 25 FPS, for example, my shutter speed stays at 1/50 of a second. If I'm shooting at 50 frames per second, for example, it stays at 1/100. This was honestly one of the biggest visual upgrades I ever made in my videos. So instead of changing shutter speed in bright condition, I learned to resolve this problem properly, and that's by using a ND filter. I use a variable ND filter because they are fast and flexible, especially when the light keeps changing. This allows me to keep my shutter speed locked, maintain natural motion blur, and still shoot in very bright environments without compromising the look. After fixing the shutter speed, I think about aperture. And for me, aperture is never about exposure, it's always about the look. So I think, how much separation do I want? How much of the scene do I want in focus? That decision comes first. Only after shutter speed and aperture I do touch the ISO. But I will come back to ISO later in the video because it becomes a much bigger topic once you start shooting in log. Now, when it comes to color profiles, this is where a lot of confusion happens. You often hear that shooting in log is always better, but I think it's not true. There is no better here. It completely depends on what you're doing. So, for example, if your goal is a speed, or if you want a good color straight out of the camera, or maybe you are producing a lot of content very quickly, shooting in standard profiles like Rec 709 makes total sense, in my opinion. But if your goal is to get the maximum out of your camera, so protect the highlights and really shape the image in post, I think that shooting in log gives you more flexibility. That's the reason why for most of my work I shoot in log, so social media production and client works. I mainly record in 4K at 25 frames per second. Sometimes I switch to 50 FPS, especially in situations where I'm not sure if I need to slow motion later in post. When it comes to stabilization, if I'm shooting handheld, I usually set it to active because it helps me a lot in keeping the footage clean and usable. If I'm using a gimbal instead, I just turn off the stabilization completely and let the gimbal do the work. For white balance, most of the time I actually leave it on auto. I always record in 10-bit because it gives me much more information to work with in post-production, especially when color grading. It's one of those settings that doesn't change how you shoot, but makes a huge difference later. And finally, autofocus. I use it all the time. Sony's autofocus, for example, is just incredibly reliable, and for the type of work I do, it allows me to focus more on composition and movement instead of worrying about focus. On both of my Sony FX3 and my Sony Alpha 7C II, I use the exact same log setup. To do this, I go into the menu, head to the video section and select log shooting settings. From there, I enable log shooting, set it to flexible ISO and choose as gamut3.cine as the color gamut. This setup gives me a very flat image, great skin tones and makes matching footage between cameras so much easier. And that's really the whole point of this video. When I switch between the FX3 and the Alpha 7C II, I don't want to think about settings. I want them to react in the same way. So when shooting in log, ISO behaves very differently. I always stick to the base ISO or the second base ISO of the camera. This gives me the best dynamic range and the cleanest image possible. Another big thing that really helps me matching the cameras is customizing the controls. This is something I always do as soon as I get a new camera. I go into the menu, then into custom functions, and I make sure both cameras are set up in the same way. So, same dials, same buttons, same logic. So for example, one dial controls the shutter speed, another one controls the ISO, the other the aperture, and I have another one for white balance. It sounds small, but in real shooting situation, it makes a massive difference. One last setting I always enable on my Sony cameras is the vertical overlay. Even when I'm recording horizontally, I can see the vertical frame, so if you create content for Instagram, Reels or Shorts, for example, this is incredibly useful. It helps you compose properly while shooting and saves you a lot of time later during the editing session. These are the settings I actually use for my professional video work, not because they are perfect, but because they are reliable. They let me focus on light, composition and storytelling. For today, it's all. See you in the next one. Bye.